The title of my presentation is How Can Underutilized Crops Help African Agriculture Adapt to Climate Change? I think the initial title that I gave was How Can Orphan Crops Help African Agriculture? And I use these words interchangeably. You'll see also in my presentation. It's just for this audience, I thought it's much nicer to use a positive word. Instead of orphan, I decided to use underutilized. So before I start the presentation, I'll just introduce myself. You can see my name. I'm originally Kenyan, born and brought up in Kenya. I studied my basic education in Kenya, my first degree in Kenya. Then I did my master's and PhD in Europe. And then I've been all over the world doing various things, but my passion is crop genomics and also basically crop genomics on underutilized species. I'm currently working for the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics. I spend 50% of my time in Patancheru in India, which is where our headquarters are. And the rest of the time I spend in Africa, mostly in Nairobi, Kenya. So to start the presentation, I will just introduce underutilized crops. So as I mentioned, there's so many different words that have been used to define underutilized crops. And this publication that was done by Tadele in 2019 summarized quite a few names that are being used. But obviously for this presentation, I've chosen underutilized. But this publication was in 2019, and since then, they've also come up with a few other terms that are used. Either it's something to suit an opportunity. Those of you who are involved in African agriculture discussions are probably aware of VACS, Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils in Africa. And there also they've defined underutilized crops differently. So they are calling them adapted crops or opportunity crops. And so every year somebody comes with a different name, but basically it just means crops with important attributes have the potential to be grown for profit or subsistence. They have been under-researched in the past and therefore have inadequate or total lack of resources, breeding resources. And in my case, since I'm into genomics, I would say genetic and genomic resources. But yeah, feel free to use your favorite term as we walk through this presentation. I have put just really, so this is not meant to be a scientific presentation. As I was saying, for me, it's more like getting to know this community and getting to share what I do, what I'm passionate about. So it's not meant to be such scientific, but I have a few results or some few slides to share on some of the things that have been done. So just here giving examples of underutilized crops, and I must say I'm being biased here because I work on millets. So I've put several millets here, ranging from finger millet, foxtail millet, proso millet, little millet. Some of these you probably haven't seen, but fonio is very common in Africa. Teff, obviously, I think there are people in this platform who work on teff, but also other underutilized crops, including lablab bean. And it was important for me to include this because my fellow, so I'm part of the award mentors, and my fellow, who is called Molly Akelo, she works on lablab bean. So I thought I really needed to represent her here. And so lablab bean appears here. But others include African eggplant, pigeon pea, sesame, etc. Now, specifically why millets feature here very broadly is because, millets are grown mainly in Asia and Africa. And looking at this graph here, where I'm also defining what climate resilience are. It's basically the ability to thrive despite extreme climatic conditions. And there's data now that shows that, you know, the temperature increases over the last maybe 5 decades has been affecting Asia and Africa a lot. And that's also specifically where the millets that I showed are being grown mainly. And so the focus in these two regions specifically has been quite much on climate resilience. And so it happens also that the crops that I work on are considered climate resilient and are grown in these two regions. But some of the traits that are considered, you know, climate resilience includes heat, drought, salinity tolerance, flooding tolerance, tolerance to biotic stresses. And one of the things that, you know, if I'm talking to an audience that are familiar with Africa is, you know, Striga hermonthia, which appears here. This has become quite a huge problem, and it gets worse with the increasing effects of climate change. One of the things that's not really that obvious, but is really necessary to pay attention to is the limiting of greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it's one of the really important climate resilience traits that we need to focus on, even though we've kind of neglected it in the past. So how can we exploit these underutilized crops to enhance climate resilience? What I've put together spans from understanding the traits that they possess, using those traits in other crops, or even using those crops to rehabilitate wastelands or to improve soil fertility, but also in the reduction of greenhouse gases. And I'm going to walk you through just one by one each of these topics, how, and some examples. Now, all these major topics that I've put together need to be done jointly with capacity building. It's of no use to have all these really wonderful studies and then we don't build capacity in the end. And again, this is a multidisciplinary research. It needs to involve everyone, ranging from gene bank, pathology, breeding, physiology, seed systems, cell and molecular biology, etc., economists, you know, gender, scientists, and then also multi-institutional. It needs to include both public and private institutions. Now, some of the things that have led to low success rate is because we never really think of these activities as multidisciplinary and multi-institutional. And most of the times when we design projects, we make it just on our fields. But ideally, we need to think about all the different disciplines as we design our projects for them to be successful. I mean, there's huge evidence showing that, you know, multidisciplinary projects are successful, multidisciplinary, multi-institutional. Now, to start with, in terms of trait characterization, underutilized crops are really important in terms of helping us understand the extreme climate resilience traits. So I'll give an example on the screen of resurrection plants, for example. These are plants, for those who may not know, these are plants that can remain dry for extended periods of time, even up to 1 year or more. And then when you expose them again to moisture, it takes them no less than 5 days, no more than a week to get back to life. If you see this screen, I mean, look at this ball here that looks really dry and desiccated, but you know, after you expose it to water, it thrives. So even though we don't eat it, we may not use it directly, but it has extremely important traits within it that we can discover and help us to improve crops that are already streamlined into our breeding programs. And there are a lot of studies now that are showing how we are utilizing some of these unique crops to improve our own crops. And I just gave some examples, screenshots there on the screen. Yeah, and then in terms of trait discovery for climate resilience, we have, and I'll give examples of crops that are specifically of crops that I work on, where we've done things like looking at resistance to Striga hermonthia. So Striga is a really terrible weed that affects cereals in Africa. And in most cases, most studies have not really been able to manage it. And so we are moving to an era where we are now able to discover the traits that are responsible for resistance and able to introduce them into improved varieties, and should be able to transfer them across different species even, now that we have several tools, advanced tools that can help us do so. But also things like, drought tolerance, a say green trait is one trait that has been studied quite intensively in sorghum. We know that sorghum is one of the most drought tolerant crops available. We know the loci that are responsible. How can we utilize that to develop varieties that are more drought tolerant, not just in sorghum, but how can we use homologs from those QTLs to enhance expression of drought tolerance in other crops that are not necessarily sorghum, but are, more susceptible to drought. For example, in maize, that is more susceptible to drought. And also sharing, recent studies, some of the results from a recent study we did in groundnut. And groundnut has a specific disease that is only present in Africa, and that's called groundnut rosette disease. How can we utilize the knowledge that we have to address some of these continent-specific problems? And in this particular study here, we used African core collection of groundnut and screened them against this disease, and were able to identify alleles that are responsible to the resistance to that disease. And then things like earliness that enables crops to mature early and escape drought, or heat tolerance. Now, I don't know if some of you know palm millet. Yeah, you must know palm millet if you're from Africa. But palm millet is considered one of the most heat tolerant crops available. Palm millet can survive heat of even over 43 degrees Celsius and still go ahead and give you some yield. Obviously, it won't be optimum yield, but just the fact that it can survive that period. And we know that recently there's a publication that showed they discovered, the genes or the QTLs that are responsible for this kind of heat tolerance. Now, that can be used for its improvement, but not just the palm millet alone, but other crops as well, by looking at homologs or synthetic QTLs in other crops that can be used to enhance heat tolerance. Now, one of the things that makes crop production difficult, especially in areas that are affected with climate change, is the increasing rate of wastelands, and especially like, salinity around the sea or the ocean areas. And one of the really unique ways of managing these kinds of soils is to use salt-tolerant genotypes. So for example, I have on the screen, a mangrove species that can be grown along the seashore to enhance or just improve the quality of the wasteland, or some perennial grasses can thrive under high salinity that can be used also in especially extremely waterlogged soils.